welcome to this lesson for Advanced Higher Biology. We are in Unit 2 and we are looking at Key Area 2 just at the start, and we're considering evolution, selection and drift. So prior to now, this is really looking back at your National 5 knowledge of evolution. There is a little bit about speciation and evolution in the higher biology course, obviously none in higher human, but we don't really build on that specifically too much. We're going to focus on what we mean by evolution, the different forms of selection, and what we mean by genetic drift today. And next lesson we'll be moving on to what we mean by allele frequencies and a little bit about the Hardy-Weinberg equation. For today though, we're looking to understand the driving forces behind evolution, and you will need to be able to explain what we mean by evolution, explain what is meant by natural selection and the types of change that may occur, explain what is meant by sexual selection and the two methods by which this might take place, explain how genetic drift acts on the genetic variation in a population, and describe the importance of bottleneck and founder effects on genetic drift. So to start off with, what are we talking about when we talk about evolution? Well, evolution is not something that happens to an individual in its lifetime. This organism may change in response to environmental influences, but these changes may not be passed on to the next generation. Generally speaking, there's a whole new field involving epigenetics, which may come to be important. However, that's not something we're going to consider at the moment. Now, let's think, for example, you might have a period of hot and sunny weather, okay? And your individual might get a sunburn, but that sunburn is not going to be passed on to their offspring. So that's the sort of thing we mean when we're talking about an individual's changes in response to their environment. Evolution, on the other hand, is what happens to a population over a number of generations. The individuals in that population are going to show genetic variation, and they are going to carry different versions of inherited traits. And that evolution will occur when the proportion of the individuals with different inherited traits change over time or change over a number of generations. So if we have a huge number of individuals with black hair and a small number of individuals with blonde hair, we're looking for those proportions to start changing over a number of generations, and that would indicate that evolution was taking place. Now, during evolution, what we're really looking at is the change in allele frequency, and that's occurring through some non-random processes, such as natural selection and sexual selection, and the more random process of genetic drift. Before we get to those though, quick reminder of what we mean by these terms. So when we're looking at allele frequency and genotypes and phenotypes, what we're talking about, remember, is the genotype is the combination of alleles. So whether or not you've got big W, or whether you're not big W, little w, or whether you've got little w. So whether you're dominant or recessive, whether you're heterozygous or homozygous, that's your genotypes. Phenotype frequency is how often we see our physical characteristics. So how many times we see purple flowers to how many times we see white flowers. Allele frequency, on the other hand, is how often each allele is present in our population. So if we look at our top population there, where we've got 3 big W's and 3 little w's. So we've got 3 dominant versions of the allele, 3 recessive versions of the allele, compared to our final population down here, where we've only got the dominant version of the allele. So clearly the allele frequency, how often we see each allele, is very different in those two populations, and that's what we mean when we talk about allele frequency. Changes in our alleles are only possible through mutations, and mutations are really considered to be essential for evolution to happen because they're the only source of new alleles for our population. Now, there's 3 possible effects of mutations on what we refer to as the evolutionary fitness of an individual. So a large number of mutations are referred to as neutral because they have no impact on the fitness of the organism or how likely they are to reproduce. Some mutations are in fact harmful. They reduce an individual's fitness, and very rarely mutations will have some kind of benefit to the fitness of the individual. Now, whether or not these mutations are passed on to the offspring is largely going to depend on these non-random processes of selection, but also it may be random due to the process of genetic drift. Now, when it comes to natural selection, this is our non-random process, and that occurs when populations produce more offspring than the environment can support, and that results in a selection pressure. So there isn't enough resources to go around to support all of those individuals. There is competition between individuals of the same species. Now, individuals which have got variations that are better suited to surviving in that environment tend to survive longer and produce more offspring, and these pass on alleles, so we have an increased allele frequency in the ones that confer an advantage. So in this example here, we have our individual little bird has produced 3 little birdies, and they have all produced offspring which are identical to them. We've had some mutations, so we've got a darker fur colour or feather colour, we've got a medium one, and we've got a very light one. Just so happens that our predators can spot the lighter ones, so he is unable to produce any further offspring. We have a mutation which is deleterious or harmful, so it's reduced his chances of surviving to the next generation. So selection has resulted in the non-random increase in the next generation. We've got more alleles which show that advantage, which show this darker feather colour, which make you more likely to survive. Over time, we start to see further mutations occurring, so we've got an even darker variant coming in now, and consequently we wind up with a population which is significantly different to where we started from. That's what we mean by natural selection, the fact that we've got too many offspring in each generation. We have selection pressures. In this case, I've suggested it would be a predator, and that results in the increase in a frequency of advantageous alleles and a non-random decrease in the frequency of problematic or harmful alleles. Now, sexual selection is also a non-random increase in the frequency of alleles. However, these are the alleles which make mating or reproduction more likely. And in fact, there are some sexually selected alleles that actually produce characteristics that may decrease an individual's survival chances. So for example, if you think of the peacock, it's got a very long tail, that actually makes it more vulnerable to predators. However, it gives it an advantage when it comes to sexual selection. There are 2 main forms of sexual selection. These are male-to-male rivalry or female choice. Now, rivalry is something that will increase the access of males to females for mating, and that might be done through either a real conflict or what we would consider to be a ritualized conflict, often seen in larger apes and chimpanzees, etc. And what we're looking at there is males who are successful tend to be those which are larger or stronger, or they're the ones which have greater weaponry, such as antlers, tusks, horns would be considered weapons in those scenarios. In other species, we have female choice, and that drives the evolution of more conspicuous markings or structures or behaviours in males as the females assess what they refer to as the fitness of the males. So the male displays, they tend to reveal what are called honest signals, and we're going to come back to this term in a few lessons' time. These are really characteristics that allow potential males to assess the genetic quality or the fitness of the males. So a good phenotypic quality, so a good physical characteristic, is usually an indicator of favourable alleles, and they increase the chances of survival of the offspring. We're also looking for a low parasite burden, and that suggests a healthy individual. And again, we'll come on to a couple of those terms later on in a few lessons' time. Now, sexual selection tends to result in distinct differences between the 2 genders. So that's referred to as something called sexual dimorphism. And it's defined as the differences in characteristics between the 2 sexes of the same species other than the differences in the sex organs. So typically we see these differences are in terms of size and coloration. So in most cases, the male is the larger, the more heavily armoured, or has more conspicuous markings or structures or behaviour. Females can generally keep themselves more inconspicuous, males are going to have more conspicuous markings. And this is going to be seen in organisms such as most birds will show sexual dimorphism, lions, obviously, deer. There are numbers of organisms which show this kind of sexual dimorphism. There is also something which you may see called reverse sexual dimorphism, where it's seen where the female tends to be the larger or the more conspicuous, but those instances are actually fairly rare. Now, our other driver of evolution is a more random process, and this is something called genetic drift. And this occurs when we have a chance event, something random, and it causes an unpredictable fluctuation in an allele frequency from one generation to the next. So it's a more random process, and that means that the individuals who are able to produce offspring are not actually selected for by any particular trait. It's by sheer chance that they reproduce. So looking at this wee picture here, on the left hand side we've got a population, we've got 3 green beetles and we've got 6 beige beetles. Through sheer chance, somebody comes along and stands on 2 of the green ones, so we've significantly reduced their population, we've significantly reduced that allele frequency. It wasn't related to the chance of being stood on what colour you were. So it was sheer chance. That trait was not specific to whether or not you got passed on to the next generation or not, or the opportunity to reproduce and pass your genes on to the next generation. So the next generation would see a higher allele frequency of those ones which give you a beige colour compared to the allele which gives you a green colour, and that is just through sheer chance. There's a couple of options where this may occur, and when we look at genetic drift as a model, you can see that on the left hand side we've got our little population of marbles there. We've got a similar number of both red and blue marbles. Through sheer chance, if you change those numbers, if you reduce the red allele, eventually you have a less likely opportunity for it to be picked for reproduction. Now, this might occur as a result of a bottleneck event, and a population bottleneck is something which has allowed the population size to dramatically reduce for at least a generation, and it can actually particularly affect alleles which are not being selected either for or against at this time. So as you can see in the diagram, we've got a parent population with a significant genetic variation. Some kind of bottlenecking event happens where we've reduced our population significantly, and only a few are able to pass on to the next generation, and just through sheer chance we have lost all but the yellow and green alleles in this situation. And a common example of this is in northern elephant seals. They have a significantly reduced genetic variation. There was a population bottleneck inflicted on them by humans in the 1890s. There was significant hunting and really reduced their population size, and as in some areas there were as few as 20 individuals. Consequently, that significantly reduced their population. Now, that wasn't related to any particular allele. Humans were coming along, we were using hunting methods, which you couldn't have a trait that would be either beneficial or harmful for. So consequently, there was no particular allele being selected either for or against. It was random, and that reduced our genetic variation among our population because we had a much smaller population. Now, their population has now increased. We've got over 30,000 of them globally now. However, their genes are still showing that sort of bottleneck effect. They've got much less genetic variation than similar populations of southern elephant seals, which were not so intensely hunted. So a bottleneck event can have quite a significant long-term effect on the genetic variation of a population. We also have the founder effect considered to be a cause of genetic drift. And this term really is referring to where we've got a scenario where a few members of a population have become isolated from the larger population, and the gene pool of the new population is not really representative of the original. So again, looking at this diagram, we've got our ancestral population of butterflies here. We've got a mixture of black, orange and white. Some of them are isolated or taken to a different area where they're no longer able to breed. They're no longer mixing with the original population. However, through sheer chance, we no longer have any of the white butterflies that have gone, so consequently we've reduced the number of the frequency of that particular allele in the colonizer population. So through sheer randomness this time. So that's what genetic drift is all about. It's about the randomness rather than them being selected either for or against. Now, when we look at genetic drift, it tends to have a more significant impact where we've got a smaller population. Each of these graphs is showing 10 possible simulations over 50 generations for a hypothetical allele. And that hypothetical allele started at a 0.5 frequency. As you can see in the smaller population, the population where there's only 20, each line indicates a different allele frequency over time. So over a number of generations, for example, up here, you might have a change from an allele frequency in 10 generations. It could change to 1, it could change to 10, it could stay at between 0.4 and 0.6. You've got much more potential variation. Whereas as the populations get larger, that allele frequency becomes far less variable. And that's really because any chance event is going to randomly affect a sample of the population. A small population is already quite a small sample. So if 25% of a population is randomly selected to pass on its alleles, then a population of 20 has only got 5 breeding individuals, whereas a population of 2,000 has got 500 breeders. And that means that alleles are more likely to be lost where we've got a gene pool of a smaller population. So from that, you should be able to explain what we mean by evolution and natural selection. You should also be able to explain sexual selection and male-to-male rivalry and female choice. You should be able to explain how genetic drift acts on a genetic variation in a population, the fact that it's completely random and has no significant impact on our allele frequencies for ones which are being selected for or against. It will just be a random increase or decrease in an allele. And we've got bottleneck and founder effects as potential mechanisms by which genetic drift might occur. As ever, please get in touch if you have any questions. You can visit the website, drop a comment below or email me at the address which is to follow.